So I will go back to what you just said about media archaeology now. So you're working on collecting previous technologies of sensory gaming, and then you're bringing them back to use. I think I understood that correctly. And so you're collaborating with the American researcher Jazz Brooks, who you just mentioned, who often uncovers the history of scratch and sniff used in cinema and games. So can you
Yeah.
elaborate on the work you're doing together and what media archaeology is? Because I think did you make up the term or
No, no, no.
was it used
That's
before?
a very well established term
Okay.
by scholars who know a lot more than I do about it.
Maybe I should have
Uh,
done better research on the term before I asked that
no,
question.
I think no, but I think the term is pretty intuitive in some ways. I mean, it's like uncovering something that is in the past. It's about scrutinizing the past to learn about the future in some ways. Understanding where things are going by looking at the past. And so it does involve oftentimes looking at dead media, which is a very interesting concept. So what we're looking at, Jazz and I, is we're looking at some companies around the turn of the 20th century that actually marketed or were developing for market consumer products to output smell from computers, basically, in people's domestic environments. So there's a couple companies where we're looking at. And what's interesting in relation to media archaeology is oftentimes kind of a critique of overly optimistic media narratives. And it's used in a critical way. But what's interesting about smell technologies is these technologies are not sitting on your desktop. I can guarantee that. So oftentimes the narratives of scented technology media are overly pessimistic. So I was looking at media history. You could look at Smell-O-Vision, you can look at Aromarama. They're not in the theater right now,
No.
and neither is the DigiSense I Smell peripheral that was being developed about just over 20 years ago. So what's really been interesting is Jazz and I are looking at some of these devices that were originally designed for consumer use. The TriSense Scent Dome, which was very interesting and actually was made commercial, and they did sell them. The DigiSense I Smell peripheral, which was under development and never fully reached the market. And these are scent devices intended for the home that were prototyped in a really interesting way. But because they're perceived as failures, there's been very little attempt to archive either the prototypes or to capture the knowledge of people who worked on them. And so I was originally looking at some of these devices, and I made a claim in a lecture like 9 years ago that the history of scented media is a litany of failure. And someone in the audience said, "What do you mean by that? Is that really true? Do we know that?" And I thought, well, that's a good question. I mean, is the fact that we don't have these devices on our desktop, does that mean they're a failure? And what Jazz and I have been doing is to approach the history of some of these technologies as not a failure, but as a series of small incremental successes. And so we go back and we talk to people who worked on these 20 years ago, and they're very excited to talk, because no one really asked them about that. What Jazz has to do is a lot of the media archaeology part is that because there's no record of many of these devices, Jazz has to go combing through various web archives to find images of these old prototypes. We understand in what sequence they were developed and how they worked. And so we understand how the technology worked. So it's quite fascinating. We're really trying to understand these devices. And ideally, we'd like to acquire some of them. Sometimes we can't even locate any of these prototypes anymore, but we'd like to acquire some of them. We'd like to get them going. We'd like to get them out in the world in some way and let people experiment with them a little bit. That's kind of our aim. But right now we do a lot of talking to people, and I mean, it's really fascinating to hear about how these devices worked as scent output devices that were intended for the home.
It's great that you mentioned you found everywhere basically that these devices were failures, because when I was doing my research about scented media, that was the same thing I found. Like everyone just talked about how bad the experience was of like Smell-O-Vision, for example. But I had the same
Mhm.
question whether it was the technology itself or whether it was actually the smells that were created or the sense that we're creative for these devices, because usually the negative feedback was that the scents were terrible or too
Exactly.
strong or whatever. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the technology itself is the problem. It means that the scents need to be adjusted, or how they're distributed needs to be adjusted in terms of intensity or whatever that may be. And so yeah, I think that's really, really cool that you found, okay, well, let's question if these are actually failures or how they could maybe be adjusted
Yeah.
to be used in the future.
It's a really good topic. I think there's a lot to be discovered here, and a lot of ways in which, first of all, we can just improve the quality of our designs, really, if we sort of uncover what, if you look at these as not just as an abject failure, but as we worked out some problem, some design problem in an interesting way. That's great. And like you said, it's really complicated why things fail too, right? We're in the material world with sense, so a bad representation is a bad representation of something. And I also, I don't want to speak for Jazz, because you should really have Jazz on this show, on a
Definitely.
podcast. But one thing that Jazz noticed is that a lot of the negativity about something like Smell-O-Vision was based on just a couple of reviews. And that oftentimes, a couple of high profile reviews could create the sense that it was a failure, even though many people found it to be positive experience, or a lot of the other reviews were good. So there's a lot of sort of outsized influence of certain voices that can make something be perceived as a failure. And I think that's what media archaeology is also intended to redress, which is, what should our understanding of these devices or these systems, what should our understanding be? And I'm interested as a designer, like, well, how can we move forward? How can we make the devices work better? And how can we make them, a more interesting experience?
And thinking about where we are going, for example, like AI, or this area that we're kind of heading towards, I think it's really interesting because right now there's a lot of issues of conserving digital art, for example, because we're losing, certain devices are going obsolete, and we're losing access to certain iOS systems if the artwork was made on an
Mhm.
iPhone or on Twitter, which is now X, or whatever that may be. So I think it's really important that for smell or for olfactory engagement, that we can actually go back and look at these devices that were made, and they're still very relevant because we're still learning
Mhm.
in the field of smell and sensory engagement. So I think that's really a important thing to think about, that we have to go back for the olfactory. We really have to go back and look at these devices and see how we can
Mhm.
use them for the future, and they're still very relevant, whereas some of these digital methods are not right now, and they're kind of going obsolete very quickly. So this is really cool. I just thought about this right now. So
It's true. It is true. And I think there's, that's, yeah, it's other really interesting things to think about too with these. I mean, the actual design space for the output devices, I mean, it's not rocket science. It's not that was complicated. I'm trying to get my head around the impact of AI for smell, both in terms of neuroscience and design. But in terms of actually creating, good scent experiences, I mean, there's a lot of intractable design problems with smell, but it's relatively straightforward set of challenges that are being faced. And I think what's interesting is, as we go back and look at these, we can see people moving forward. And that's why I'm really optimistic in this area. I really think that, we're understanding there's so many reasons to be optimistic about scent, and thinking about scent experiences that we can have. But we really can move forward and solve some of these problems bit by bit, which is what those companies were doing 20 years ago that are now perceived as failures.
yeah.